I'm Julia Harrison, the Director of the Frost Centre for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies. And tonight's talk is the last in the North at Trent 2012 series. And I'm very pleased to welcome tonight's speaker. Dr. Julie Cruikshank is someone obviously known to all of you in the audience, but is someone who has made a particular impact in the field of anthropology, Indigenous studies, and just a greater realm of understanding of Indigenous people in this country. Has been read by students in anthropology, history, Indigenous studies programs in universities across Canada and the States and globally. She is now Professor Emerita from the University of British Columbia, and from 1997 to 2003 she was a professor in anthropology at the University of British Columbia. She received her PhD in 1987 from the University of British Columbia, having done her MA there previously and her BA in anthropology from the University of Toronto. For more than a decade in the 1970s and 80s, Julie Cruikshank lived in the Yukon Territory, working with senior Athabascan and Tlingit women who wanted to record their life stories. Working closely with these women and their families, she prepared booklets under their authorship documenting family history, place names, land use, social history, and other subjects, largely absent from history books. Life Lived Like a Story, which is a book that many have used at Trent and was certainly my first introduction to her work, was written in collaboration with three of her Yukon teachers, Angela Sidney, Annie Ned, and Kitty Smith. And it received the Macdonald Prize in Canadian History in 1991. It's good to know that the historians took notice of what anthropologists were doing. Professor Malloy. Another book about oral history was commissioned for use in Yukon high schools and was prepared with the guidance of the Committee of Yukon Elders. Her books, The Social Life of Stories and Do Glaciers Listen? Local Knowledge, Colonial Encounters, and the Social Imagination, both discuss the work stories do in Indigenous communities where they continue to be told. But she has also extended her research to northern Siberia, where she has worked, where she worked in both on oral history projects in 1996 and 2003. Julie Cruikshank has been well recognized and deservedly for her work. In 2010, she became a Fellow of the Royal Society. She was also that year the Carnegie Centenary Professor at the University of Aberdeen. Her book, Do Glaciers Listen? Which I have to say is one of the most, to me, is the sterling example of interdisciplinary scholarship at its highest level. But that book has won the Clio Award the North from the Canadian Historical Association, the Victor Turner Prize in Ethnographic Writing, which is given by the Society for Humanistic Anthropology, the Julian Stewart Book Award from the Anthropology and Environment section of the American Anthropology Association, and the K.D. Savastra, the prize awarded by UBC. So I think it's very impressive that one piece has received recognition from so many different dimensions of scholarship and the Academy and beyond. In 2001 from 2003, she was the Brenda David and David McLean Chair in Canadian Studies at UBC. She has won the UBC Prize for Excellence in Teaching. She was the Isaac Walton Killam Memorial Faculty holder of this Killam Faculty Fellowship, and she also won the Killam Research Prize at UBC. It is a very great honor and a sincere pleasure to welcome Julie Cruikshank to Trent this evening and her talk, Listening for Different Stories, Indigenous Knowledge and Its Transformations.
If I could just say a few words about the title and why I chose this. When Julie invited me to come, I decided that what I'd like to do is try and present on something that I'm working on rather than something that was completely finished, and I really welcome feedback and criticism on this particular topic. Graham Wynne, who's a geographer at UBC, has organized, he's the McLean Chair in Canadian Studies this year, and he has set up a project called The Nature of Canada and invited some historians and some geographers to write short essays on particular topics. And he asked me if I would write one on Indigenous ecological knowledge. I wasn't sure that that was a good idea for a bunch of reasons, but I thought that I'd do it because I think it's interesting for me to be able to talk about some of the conversations over the years that I've had with people in the Yukon about Indigenous knowledge and some of the ways those conversations are changing. So in that spirit, I'll proceed with this story, listening for different stories. The terms Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge came into widespread use in Canada, especially in Northern Canada, in the early 1990s. I think you can really track this in the literature, and you begin to see this term turning up all the time. And I think it's very interesting because the term is now used internationally. UNESCO has panels on Indigenous knowledge. And so it's a kind of, these terms begin to change and to accumulate new meanings as they travel. Meanings that have real consequences in Aboriginal communities throughout the world, but certainly in the Yukon. And there's some discussion about that now. Historically, we know that there have been many terms used for Indigenous knowledge, many of which reveal more about colonial ambition than they do about Indigenous worlds. But 150 years ago, for instance, we might have heard the term savagery or superstition. And then terms change, so you hear about beliefs, which is a politer way maybe of saying things, but beliefs or culture. And then onward, it means the term's been used spirituality, ecological knowledge, and now Indigenous knowledge. And I think that there appears to be a really progressive move in language and the way things are being described. But some anthropologists question whether this is just another way of using what they call the tribal slot. There's new language, but certain other things stay the same. So I'm interested in these terms and what they mean and how they're changing. And I think terms are beginning to change again in some ways. Its most recent manifestation is traditional ecological knowledge, usually referred to as TEK or TEK on the west coast and in the north. I don't know how common that term is here, but it's very ever present in the Yukon Territory and in Northwest Territories. Has entered two debates recently in Canada. One is the contributions that local knowledge can make for scientists, field scientists particularly, biologists, geologists, geophysicists, people working in Aboriginal territories, and whether they might be able to learn something from local people that would contribute to their discipline. The other that interests me, and I think it's more recent, particularly in the 21st century, is its use in regulatory science and in hearings that are being held surrounding pipelines and so on in the north. And that takes it in other directions. So I just want to say a couple of words about each of these, and then I'll come back to some more about conversations. Tech studies, I think, undoubtedly began as a genuine effort to establish that people who pursue land-based economies know things about what we call nature. Advocates, and I would include myself in that 20 years ago, certainly encouraged field scientists to consider how Indigenous hunters and fishers' ecological knowledge accumulated over generations might contribute something to the kind of work that they were doing. And some scientists now are assigning value, I think would be a good way of putting it, assigning value to land-based hunters' knowledge in projects that try to, and this is their language, to integrate Indigenous knowledge into modernist frameworks. But I don't think this was ever really straightforward, particularly in environmental studies. Scientists who are studying environmental change talk about the need to disentangle cultural, natural and social factors. They talk, for instance, people looking at climate change talk about disentangling what they consider natural cycles and what they consider anthropogenic causes. So trying to separate these kinds of things, whereas Indigenous oral traditions, certainly in the Yukon, try to merge these two things, the social histories with the environmental histories in some ways, and to draw connections among the two. And I think that that's an important distinction, because it sometimes makes it difficult to see how these can be integrated into science when they may be trying to do different things, these narratives. In northwestern Canada, I'll come back to this map. I just want to show it to you really briefly now. In northwestern Canada, this is an interesting area for traditional ecological knowledge studies, because late stages of a period that some scientists call the Little Ice Age in this region meant that what you have at the same time, you have changes going on in the environment, geophysical changes, because in fact these glaciers, which are schematically drawn in white here, and I'll come back to talk about some of them specifically, were much larger than they are now. the environment, the landscape looked really different in this area. At the same time, you were getting historical changes because the fur trade was moving into this region. Fur traders were coming up these rivers, the Alsac River. I'm sorry, I did have a pointer, but I think I've left it somewhere. So coming up this river into this country. So you had at the same time geophysical changes and human historical changes. So in a way that for Aboriginal people, I think makes those two really come together very clearly. And I'll come back and talk about this a little bit later. But I want to say something too about the bureaucratic changes that are happening with policy with tech that are going on now. I think that scientists are trying to do one thing, but bureaucratic efforts to incorporate tech, or TEK, as it's sometimes called, into regulatory science and management occurred in this area in tandem with land claims, the settlement of land claims in the Yukon, and also claims to rights to land and to lands more generally. You can see here, this is, to give you a sense of, this is Alaska, Yukon here, and northern British Columbia. And the area that I've worked mainly in is in the Yukon territory east of this region. But even, again, just speaking about the bureaucratic kinds of changes that are happening, even the most isolated communities, any Aboriginal communities anywhere in Canada, we know are now tied to global markets and to international forms of exchange. And I think arguably, in addition to traditional knowledge, Aboriginal people know a great deal now, possibly more than most Canadians, about neoliberal economic and management strategies because they have such consequences in these communities. So in Northern Canada, their current engagement in land claims, which are settled in the Yukon to a large extent, requires now Aboriginal participation in environmental assessments that are occurring with reference to oil, gas, pipelines, minerals, the whole range of things that are opening in the north right now. These community hearings are mandated by national policies that now smoothly incorporate terms like tech or co-management into these bureaucratic frameworks. It's a very different time for those of you who remember the Berger inquiry, when whatever we remember about or think about Berger, he was at least going to communities and talking to people on their own terms. These community hearings are now very different. They're regulated much more strictly. So not only do First Nations bear the brunt of decisions about pipelines or mineral developments, they have to resort to uncharacteristic ways of speaking in these hearings in order to accommodate the consultative framework that's set up and designed by the modern bureaucratic state. This integrationist model, because integration is always the term that's being used, integration of traditional knowledge into these modernist frameworks. This integrationist model of knowledge claims to respect cultural difference, but apparently requires no corresponding shift in epistemological or moral stances by the certified experts who are supporting the other sides of these arguments. So it's a complicated situation that becomes more complicated even with land claims, I think. But there are other ways to think about knowledge, and I want to talk a bit about that now. In framing this essay, am I speaking loudly enough? Can you hear me all right? If I speak too quickly, too, just let me know. In framing this essay, I want to draw on conversations about local knowledge practices in Northern Canada, discussions in which I participated over about 4 decades in different ways. I'm using the term here, traditional knowledge, to refer to what we might call tacit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that's embodied in everyday experience, reproduced in behavior, in everyday speech, the kind of knowledge you need just to live in the world. So rather than asking how information from hunters might contribute to scientific models, I would like to argue that, especially in this region, the possibility of surprises. We should be thinking about not things that will fit, that will integrate neatly into scientific models or any other models, but we can really, if we look for the possibility of surprises, we might learn a great deal from puzzling accounts that don't seem to fit into official regimes of knowledge. So I'll start with a story from Canada that, from this region, from the far northwest, that I think captures both the fissures and the possibilities of some of these discussions about local knowledge. In 1982, I'm really sorry, I somehow forgot my pointer somewhere in the room. Actually, you know, if you'll excuse me for a second, I think I know where it is. This will help me jump about. In 1982, there was a small conference held in Haines Junction, which would be This smart map doesn't have the Alaska Highway on it, but the Alaska Highway runs along here, and I'll come back to say more about that later. Haynes Junction would be about here. Whitehorse is somewhere over here. It was the conference was held in Haynes Junction with the idea of bringing together historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, First Nations, and interested public to talk about human history in the southwest Yukon, in this area. This was a really unusual conference at the time. It wouldn't be unusual now, but 30 years ago it was, because a conference of this kind, if it had been held, would normally be held in Whitehorse, the capital, rather than in a community. But this was terrific. It was interesting. People came from up and down the Alaska Highway, from 100 miles away in each direction. It was held in the community hall in Haynes Junction. Carloads of people arrived, and elders slowly filled up all the front rows, the first 3 or 4 rows. Throughout the day, academic speakers gave interesting reports on the research to engaged and very interactive audiences. Memorably for everyone, though, Mrs. Annie Ned, a senior woman who was sitting right in the front row, stood up in the middle of one of the papers in the middle of the afternoon after listening patiently most of the day. And she stood up and she said to all of us, "Where do you people come from?" "Outside?" She said, "You people talk from paper. I want to talk from Grandpa." And so saying, she began to talk about the same things that had been being discussed all that day as someone who had lived, hunted, trapped, raised children, grandchildren for almost a century in this region. I just want to point out, Mrs. Ned was made a member of the Order of Canada, largely for her historical research work, the work that she contributed in the southern Yukon. She proceeded then to talk, and but what she said that always stuck with me, she said, "You need to listen 4 different stories." Not 2 different stories, but 4 different stories. Listening 4 different stories, she indicated, is quite different from just listening to them, because it requires more attention, more engagement, more reflection, more curiosity. About what it means. She said it helps you figure out what you need to know to be able to listen for stories. So my education in listening had begun about 10 years earlier than that, because I had come to the Yukon early in the 1970s. So when I heard her speak that day, I was really intrigued by how she'd speak to her audience. I'd been living there since about 1971, and I'd worked closely with senior women to document life stories that they insisted should be passed on to younger women. Now you might ask what a non-Aboriginal woman was doing this kind of work at that point, but my friends then were all young Aboriginal women who were very interested in setting up the procedures for land claims, for becoming involved themselves in the different issues that were going to lead up to a land claim settlement 20 years later. So they decided that someone like myself with some minimal training in anthropology and willing to take direction from families could do this kind of work. They were quite familiar with the ethnographies, and they knew that there was a lot written about men's work and men's subsistence, and they wanted a record of what women were doing as well. So the other thing that's interesting to remember is that at this time oral history was pretty new, at least in this part of the world. Alex Haley had just written his book Roots, Studs Terkel had written his book Working, but historians and anthropologists at that point were thinking about oral history as a kind of method rather than as something that might actually change the way people looked at the world. The idea was that you might be able to record accounts that could then be measured against more standard kinds of things like archival documents and linguistics and so on to add these stories together. But before long, there was a lot of criticism about the notion of mixing and stirring, taking different kinds of evidence and trying to turn it into one big narrative. And the suggestion that maybe stories told from the perspective of people whose voices had been left out of history for a long time might contribute different angles on this whole project. So I just want to say that I think it's very interesting that at this point in 1982, Mrs. Ned, who's living in an what might be called out of the way or distant place. She actually lived in a cabin on the Alaska highways 35 miles north of Whitehorse. She wasn't even living in a small community. She was still speaking to what were then international debates that were developing throughout the world about what oral history might do. Most of the senior women I worked with during those years were born just before or just after 1900. And so I anticipated hearing stories about the Alaska Highway, about the Klondike Gold Rush, about the intrusion of the state into family life, the kinds of things that would be reflected in modernizing lives. I also anticipated that this is what my younger friends and their families expected me to do, make a contribution to land claims. But to my surprise, all of these women responded to my questions, which I tried to ask carefully, but they would respond to my questions by asking me to write down, record narratives that I recognized as classic or traditional. So with some misgivings, I found myself preparing lengthy booklets under their direction that took us very far from what I thought was our original purpose at that time. The majority of narratives that they asked me to record center on meetings between a human person and an unexpected visitor who looks like an ordinary person, but is soon revealed to be an animal in human guise. From the beginning, it's really clear that human hubris has caused this. Somebody's done something to cause this. Some person has done something to maybe showing off or behaving recklessly, but in some way has insulted an animal species. Sometimes the protagonist is accused of, people would often say, playing with or fooling around with fish or animals, whatever species. And that's what sets the story in motion. This medallion, this is a speaker's staff, for those of you who can see it. It's the medallion here I'd like you to look at, because I think it's remarkable in how it sort of reflects some of these themes. It was made by a man named Mr. Albert Isaac, and it's now in the McBride Museum in Whitehorse. The animal person in this narrative, many of them follow this pattern, entices the human protagonist away on a long journey across an identifiable boundary. You can see this as a kind of boundary. From a familiar world to a world that's white and colorless. It's without color. They reach a village where everybody looks human, but it soon becomes clear that to the host that the persons who welcome them are actually other than human animals. They're recognizably persons, but they're animal. The human visitor struggles to make sense of the host's cultural habits. They look just like humans to him. And in one case, usually the person is very hungry. This has been a long journey. So in one case, a boy taken by fish asks for food, and he points to some fish eggs. But people are shocked. This is unconscionably rude, because fish eggs are not food in that particular context. By the same token, when they offer him food, he's quite concerned, because he knows these are things that he's not supposed to eat. At home, this would be taboo. So there's a whole lot of sorting that goes on. He also knows that food taboos are a good way of signaling whether people are human or more than human, or how they really fit into the world. Everything's strange, confusion abounds. It's a world turned upside down. And gradually the visitor becomes accustomed to these new surroundings, and then the great risk always is that acculturation will take place. That the person will become fitting in so well that he or she won't be able to go back home. Become transformed into a member of the host species, unable to return. And the rest of the story traces the journey back home, which is often a very long part, and sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. But the main thing about these stories, that I think is true in every single case, is that they never identify what we call nature as a separate category. It's never identified as a separate place. Rather, if there's one theme that characterizes these stories, knowing the world is largely about overcoming this boundary between self and the world, which again, we might see as on the speaker's staff. It's getting past that boundary. Stories mobilize a complex set of humans and non-humans entangled in these relationships, characterized by transformation, fluidity, and mutual interdependence. It's all about relationships. So it rapidly became clear to me in the work I was doing that these women were saying to me, in effect, when you know enough to ask the right question, when you actually begin to know what you don't already know, when you learn what you don't already know, then perhaps we can have a conversation. Maybe. Never clear. It's not for a long time. In other words, they were providing me with the kind of unfamiliar scaffolding, that intellectual scaffolding that I needed before we could even begin a conversation. I came to recognize that the stories they wanted to pass on were indeed life stories, because they were meant to teach us how to be in the world, how to comport oneself, how to situate oneself in relation to other beings that many of us in this room might now call nature. So, I was very pleased when a biologist who'd been present at that conference where Mrs. Ned stood up, asked me if he could come to visit next time I went to see her. He'd heard her intervention, and he had some questions for her, and she'd referred that day to caribou And biologists at that point were very concerned. They knew that there were two species of caribou in the southern Yukon that had moved completely away. They moved far north. They didn't know really when or how it had happened, and he thought that perhaps she would be able to help him. They know a whole lot more about these species now, incidentally, which I could talk a lot about, but I won't. It was just that he felt this was a real opportunity. He could talk with her. She was just as delighted to see him. She was always interested in what scientists were up to. She thought they were an interesting lot. And he had very thoughtful questions for her, which he asked very respectfully. And in a manner in which I recognized, she volunteered a narrative about the last time caribou were seen in the southern Yukon. Reportedly, she said, and I'm just summarizing a very complicated story, caribou had enticed a man away who had shamanic powers. He was gifted with particular powers. He was there, and then suddenly he disappeared. No one knew where he had gone. Sometime later, his kinsmen saw a caribou sitting by itself on a lake, and when they heard the caribou singing his song, they knew that this was the shaman, and they knew what they had to do. They knew what their responsibilities were. So they enticed him back. They got him to come back to the village. They went through a whole series of rituals to try and bring him back into the world. They were eventually able to draw him back, but the transition was alarmingly difficult, and he was never able to hunt caribou or eat caribou again. The story she told that biologist that afternoon, both of us, as the light faded and she sang the song that the caribou had been singing in her powerful voice. The biologist was deeply impressed to be with her, but he was confronted with what for him was an apparent mixing of nature and culture. And he reluctantly admitted that in his world, this was not the kind of information that had a place in the realm of expert knowledge that he required for his research. So we drove back to town. Now, for Mrs. Ned, knowing caribou involves understanding something about the reciprocal relations that bind humans to the animals they hunt. That's the first thing you need to know. Her story's protagonist would have returned with privileged information, insights about caribou, expectations governing good hunting, a whole range of things. If caribou left the region, she was saying, the responsibility was, it was humans, human responsibility, no doubt about it. The biologist would not have disagreed with this about human impacts. He was thinking that the gold rush had probably had a whole lot to do with this. But the key thing is that Mrs. Ned's account that day, her explanation, fit the genre of traditional story, not the idea of traditional knowledge that was the paradigm that soon would take root among researchers working on regulatory sciences like forestry, fishery, and wildlife management. And the biologist's response, I want to point out, I'm not fingering the biologist here, I have to point out it was not the least bit unlike my own experience when I wanted to hear what my genre, what I thought were life stories. And it took me a long time to understand what that was. The problem was that the biologist had a day job and had to go back to town, and I was in a much more fortunate position of being able to continue working with Mrs. Ned for a long period of time. Well, a decade later, by the 1990s, systematic use of the term tech had taken root among researchers working across the Arctic, and I think very much in British Columbia as well, and possibly elsewhere. Increasingly, I think the tensions still hover on the same axis that Mrs. Ned identified in 1982. Indigenous studies may frame their objective as listening and learning from knowledgeable individuals in Aboriginal communities, but attempts to sort of integrate or harness data from Indigenous experts to modernist science reveal very sharp asymmetries in research processes, in translation, who gets to do the translating, in outcomes, and above all, in how participants define knowledge in the first place. Its 21st century incarnation as tech often presents local knowledge as an object for science or for government, rather than as based on concepts that might inform broader understandings of the world. Arguably, local knowledge isn't something static waiting around for curious, diligent outsiders to discover. It's continuously remade in these situations of human encounter. It's one of the reasons Mrs. Ned was so interested in meeting him, because she was interested in what he thought about caribou as well. Knowledge is always, she was always learning. I just want to say a few words about ontology, because I think what some anthropologists refer to as an ontological turn is really enlivening discussions about what happens when local ways of learning become entangled with these more powerful narratives about nature. This term ontology is defined in many ways. You can see many dictionary definitions, but they're all fairly close to this. And ontology refers to the experience of being in the world, how we come to know the world, what beings or entities we think inhabit that world. This is where it gets complicated for some of us. And our understanding of the relationships among those beings. And that differs dramatically as we move around the globe. In the subarctic, knowing is always centered on social relationships among beings that include humans, but also other than human, non-human persons, beings. Animals, sentient landscapes, more than human forces alive in the world, they're all equally real and they're all equally important. Again, I think the word knowledge is a bit of a tricky one here. We treat it as a noun when it's used in English. Concept of knowledge in this world, in the subarctic world, is described more as a verb. It's an activity. It's knowing. It's about knowing the world rather than knowledge, rather than a thing you can put your hands around. Primary knowledge, people would agree, and I think this is really important to stress. Primary knowledge is gained from being in the world, being on the land, getting direct experience from dwelling on the land. But the women I worked with would say that in the absence of such day-to-day experience, which for many reasons now is much less available for young people, transmission through oral tradition provides a secondary strategy. They would never say it's a primary strategy. They would say it's, if you can't be on the land, this is one of the things, this is one of the ways you can still learn. So crucially, for me, what I think is interesting about this is that an ontological approach like this makes visible Euro-American ontology as just one more ontology among others. Not a privileged one among others. And it offers potential for discussions about other forms of being modern. Just to characterize this contrast briefly so that we can, to talk about what our ontology, whatever that means, Euro-American ontology, I think that we can recall the influence of, René Descartes, whose ideas have been really important in North America and in Europe for the last 300 years. A key feature of the Cartesian tradition has been to keep humans and non-humans separate. Entities, it's enshrined a series of dichotomies that we all know and we're all critical of, but nevertheless they're familiar. Mind, body, subject, object, self, other, person, thing, and above all, nature, culture. So arguably, I think one can say that this mind-body dualism is at the root of our belief that we can separate nature from culture, that we can disembed knowledge about nature, what we call nature, from social relational contexts, which is something that I think does happen very often in our world, in our university worlds, for instance. And also that we can view nature as a passive object we can master and exploit by applying labor and technology. Long history of that, and it continues. Max Weber thought a lot about this, and he used to attribute what he called the disenchantment of the modern world to this distancing in a way from nature. He said much more about it than that, but I think this sort of always resonates for me. Our modernist ontology, say Euro-American ontology, precludes the possibility that stories about humans and animals exchanging perspectives on proper comportment might offer valuable insights about the world, about the modern world. So a conventional critique of this ontology is that it flirts with essentialism by assuming that somehow firmly bounded, homogeneous, timeless, ahistorical communities exist. But that's far too simple, and I don't think that that's good enough. Edward Sapir used to say, all systems leak. There are no such things as firmly bounded communities. All modern Indigenous communities struggle daily with tough economic decisions, tough political decisions that are debated, discussed, revised on an ongoing basis. People don't all think the same way. They discuss and they come to agreement, and agreements may break down, and they come just like everybody else. Other agreements may come. Conflicting views are experienced not just within communities, but very much often by the people who are elected to represent or nominated to represent members in adversarial negotiations with government, which makes it very difficult for many of these individuals. So I would say, arguably, rather than being essentialist, this ontological turn identifies a central modern dilemma of our time. relations among humans with what we call nature. I think we all have a relational idea with nature, but they vary considerably. We can maybe come back to that. So my question would be, and I'll come back to this later, I don't think I can answer this, but it's a good question, I think. What would integration of Indigenous knowledge look like if it began from Indigenous perspectives, rather than presumptions about data for science or for policy? What if you start with Indigenous ideas rather than questions by science or government? I just want to show you a few slides about why this is such a big issue in northwestern North America. Our glacier is good to think with, yes. Claude Lévi-Strauss, as an anthropologist, people probably recognize his name. He famously argued that some phenomena are, as he said, good to think with. So in that spirit, I returned to think about my conversations with senior women who impressed on me the significance of their stories. There were a lot of stories that I spent a lot of time and years trying to understand, and I still don't claim to be able to understand many of them. If I was initially disconcerted by the permeable, negotiable character of boundaries between humans and other than human animals, in the stories I heard, I was even less prepared for sentient landscapes that respond. In the 1970s, the women I knew insisted on including glacier narratives in their life stories, even though they lived some distance inland from glaciers. The women I met, I could not understand why they were talking about glaciers, because I had no understanding at that time that they had ever lived near glaciers. They certainly didn't now. Glaciers that concerned them exhibited unusual behavior, and they appear as willful beings that respond very much directly to humans and very dramatically to human activity, often with devastating results. Just to say a few words about this region, these mountains, these glaciers are supported by some of the highest mountains in North America. They're extremely high mountains. These glaciers have been here since the last ice age. Since they've been here for 10,000 years. They're melting now. They've been there for a very long time, but they're changing very, very rapidly. What's significant with the narratives is that these ice fields have these glaciers that surge, glaciers that will sit still for a period of time and then move dramatically forward. A lot could be said about that, but I'll just say that these glaciers also exist in Greenland and in the Antarctic, where they have really serious implications for climate change. Scientists, many of them tend to prefer working here because it's accessible. You can go up the Alaska Highway, you can get a helicopter, you can go in, you can go to a glacier, and you can do work. And I know people who've been working here for 40, 50 years on glaciers looking at this surging issue. I'll just hone in on a couple of. Oops, sorry, you did get the red dot. I just don't get it here. All right, if you could just, the next few slides I'll show you because I think they're worth looking at. The first one, first of all, sorry, this is the Alsac River, which runs right down to the coast. Tachancini River, some of you may know better, runs down to the coast. The glaciers, there are a number that abut up against the Alsac, and the first one I'll show you is the Low Glacier. The second one I'll show you simply because it was surging very recently, and I have a shot of that so you can see what a surging glacier looks like, the Tweedsmuir. Surging glaciers basically will sit there for years, maybe 40 years, very stable. And then sometimes they'll move several kilometers in a very short time, within a year easily, probably faster than that. Because in this case, because they're near, so many of them are near a river, they can create ice-dammed lakes that build up and disgorge when the ice thins and the dam fractures. The first one I'll show you is this one, Low Glacier. The name locally is Nahludi, meaning fish stop, because it stopped salmon that went up the river. There are landlocked salmon in little lakes up here, these little lakes, but they got there by coming up this river. There are no salmon coming up that river now. This glacier, Nahludi, it's just to give you a sense. Tell me if you like. Can you see past me? It's 5 kilometers wide at the face, just to give you some sense of the scale. I took this picture just a few years ago, and now here's where the glacier is. This is fully exposed at the face, so it just gives you some sense because it's an enormous glacier. The story that people tell about it is what fits the same pattern I mentioned before in some ways, and it's about some people who are coming up, Tlingit traders coming up the coast, up the Alsac River. A youngster is with them. The youngster has a temerity to make a very unfortunate and very rude comment to a shaman, a man who's gifted with different powers. claiming that because he had a bald head, and claiming his head looks like a glacier, resembles a glacier, and this is the humans fooling around story that gets him into deep trouble. The aggrieved shaman came to a mountain right across this from here, Gotthard Mountain. It's a mountain that, if some of you may have been in this area, it's polished like glass because of this glacier. It reached the wall and it built up to a very high level. Scientists would say, here we've got the Low Lake Glacier here. So it came right across the Alsac River, built up against a mountain right here, and created this lake, which is about 100 kilometers long. There's where the Alaska Highway is, for those of you who've been in that area. It was well underwater for this period of time. Scientists say that this happened at least 5 times in the last 3,000 years. They think more, but they know at least that many times. Most recently, it can be dated largely through oral tradition to about early 1850s. So 1852 is when Frederica de Laguna's work suggests that's where the downriver stories, when the ice dam burst, could be dated to that time. The geophysicists say that when it emptied in a couple of days. It's sort of like the Amazon River erupting. So again, this is just to give you the sense of the force. If you're living in a landscape like this, as I later learned these women were, it's unsurprising that they're very complicated stories about glaciers, and this is only one of many. I'll show you, yes, here's another one. This is the Tweedsmuir. This is the Alsac River. I've been in this area a number of times. You wouldn't have ever known, you knew the glaciers were somewhere back here, but you couldn't even see this until this was 2007. Chris Larson took this photograph. They had a camera sitting here, taking photographs every few hours, expecting it would fully cross and block the river again, and it came right up to the edge, but then it didn't. It stopped. One of the many taboos about being around glaciers, and what you should do is, women insist that there are strict rules apply to cooking near glaciers. Food should be boiled, it should never be fried, no liquid should flow from the cooking pot, lest the glacier or the beings within the glacier sense this and are affronted. You could go so far to say that the fat that they're talking about is like lard. It's moose fat, which is made into lard. It's like a white block, and when it's heated, it melts in a way that it begins to flow very rapidly. It makes a lot of noise, like a surging glacier does, and some women would say that this could be considered mimicking a glacier. It's like playing with, just fooling around with again. But that is, people would very often, some of the older ladies were very concerned about hikers, all these people who are hiking in these areas, which is now a park. I'll come back to that in a few moments. Or scientists who are working in that area, because they're concerned about what they're eating and what they're cooking, and the fact that they might bring on one of these surges by their ignorance. Just to give you an example of this, I spent some time in a glacier camp near Steele Glacier, for anybody who knows. This is Mount Steele. When we arrived, he said, that's interesting. This is somebody who'd been up there for 45 years every summer, and he said, I've never seen, see that horseshoe-shaped thing? He said, I've never seen that before. I think there's something going on here that we should keep an eye on. And every morning we'd look at it, and every morning it looked the same. And the day we were leaving, miraculously, we were sitting there, and suddenly there was a huge explosion. It's about 30 or 40 miles away, but the sound came long before you could see what was actually happening. And the glacier, just half the mountainside fell off, frankly. That's what it looked like. And then we were sitting there, and I'm sitting there with my camera, taking photographs, and the scientists were wondering where you go when it comes over the next loop, which it did. It came right over onto the glacier, but we were far enough away. I was alarmed by these. I took these photographs down to show an elder who's a friend of mine, Marge Jackson, who you may know from Maine's Junction, who's a lady who's now in her 90s, and she had one question: what are those guys cooking up there? and I thought that was very perceptive. These are the kinds of things that people are concerned about scientists. I mean, the one thing about talking to scientists is that they could also be creating dangerous situations. So. These narratives then raise really interesting questions about unorthodox relationships among persons, landscape features, things, and all of us, including features of glacier, about what we might call environmental knowledge. When I turned to the scientific literature and some of the historical literature, I learned exactly what these women were saying. This is just very briefly to run through this. When the Alaska Highway was built, it was run up this area. Just this area all the way to Fairbanks. At that point, the military, there were some 30,000 military and civilians building that highway. They requested permission to hunt on their days off. They all had one day off a week. There was tremendous amount of overhunting. Elders will talk about how people would shoot something, go back and try and get some help to take it out, and then they couldn't find it again. So scientists were sent, and they proclaimed that this area must be turned into a protected area. So it's now a park. At that point, it was simply a protected area. However, Aboriginal people were moved out of the park. This has the best sheep hunting anywhere in North America. It's remarkable. People were moved out, so you had the situation that, and they were moved into these villages and forbidden to hunt in the park. A number of people, including a former student here, probably may have heard stories about her talking about Alice Johnson from Burwash Landing. Their committee was centrally involved in a lot of very complicated land cases about this, but people were sent to jail for hunting Aboriginal people in the park. So, and again, I was struck, just thinking about the stories these women told and how long it might take to understand them, I was struck by the comment that Walter Benjamin made so many years ago about the difference between what I would now call tech and stories. He said, information is static. It's useful when it's new, and then it's absorbed and it's gone. A story is different. It doesn't expend itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength, and it's capable of releasing it even after a long time. So these stories, I think, do tell us a tremendous amount about environmental knowledge and even more about history. The kinds of knowledge that Mrs. Ned and her colleagues wanted to pass on suggest that relational knowledge practices encompass humans and nature, and that that's a really key feature that we have to think about. Nobody thinks any of these stories provide final answers, but rather they encourage listeners to think about why a particular story would be told at a particular time to make a contribution to the conversation. And that's always what I realized these women were trying to say. Listen would be what they say. Think about it. So just to sort of summarize this part, and then I want to go on to something else time-wise. I'll move along quickly, though. Both science and Indigenous knowledge, I think, potentially contribute to understandings of the nature of Canada, but what they contribute may differ. I actually think this opens up many more questions for social sciences and humanities than for sciences. Somehow tech is always linked with science, but I think for all of us in this room, this opens up a whole lot of interesting questions about these things. This strict dualism, partitioning nature from social relations, may characterize regulatory policy-driven research. But I think, even climate scientists, in a way, are thinking differently about this. Climate scientists would agree that there are no longer sharp divisions between global climate change and human behavior, that you have to take into account the anthropogenic kinds of change as Earth, oceans, atmosphere, all become implicated in our relations with what we call nature, with the natural world. Hunters and fishers created new knowledge by focusing on these relationships and the kinds of transactions, good transactions and bad transactions. Some worked, some didn't. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail, but people are as interested in talking about the failures as about the successes, because that's how one learns. They would say, okay, well, I want to go on, I'm just going to skip through, I'll come back to a story about Mrs. Smith at the end, but for time I want to skip through. I want to go back to this question about how would this look if we began with local questions. This person, the melodious name, Eduardo Vivero de Castro, is a Brazilian anthropologist, and I think his writing is very interesting. I put two references here for anybody who's interested, but I can also give them to you afterwards if it's hard to read. You could also get them by Googling him, but these two are the most accessible. I think he is trying to look at if you begin with local knowledge. Vivero de Castro works in the Amazon. And he argues that Indigenous knowledge could provide crucial insights for all of us, for all scholars, for everyone, given the cracks in the modernist project as we now know it. And we see it around us in many ways. He maintains that even though much of the world now speaks and acts as though everybody sees nature and culture as distinct, separate categories, this is in no way universal. It's just the way some of us think. Well, we'll come back to that. But he points to what he calls Amerindian perspectivism. He describes this as an indigenous theory that he argues is widespread in both South America and North America. His research is based in the Amazon, but what caught my attention is the dramatic number of references he uses from northern Canada. A whole series of references. And he goes on to say that he thinks that these ideas are probably even more fully developed in northern North America than they are in the Amazon. I'm just going to summarize what he says. It's very dense, and I'm going to try and summarize it quickly because I think some of you will be interested. According to this theory of Amerindian perspectivism, he would say this is an Amerindian theory. The world is inhabited by a range of living beings that can't easily be sorted into categories like nature and culture. It's far too complicated, he would say. Throughout the Americas, indigenous peoples all identify an original state in which humans and animals were able to communicate freely and shared a common condition of humanity at one time. This is true, I think, and many of you will recognize this, throughout North America, but he would say in both continents. To make the distinction, he would say people shared a condition of humanity, not animality, as in our foundational narrative of evolution, but humanity. I just want to point out that I'm not trying to diss evolution. Somebody once thought that I was trying to do that. I'm just saying that's a good way to see the contrast. Because they were once human, animals continue to retain human traits, he says, and this would be what he was hearing in the Amazon, and we can see this if we pay attention. In this ontology, everybody understands that animals, humans, and sometimes features of landscape all see the world from distinct points of view. Now, he says, don't confuse this with relativism, that old catchphrase in early anthropology courses. He says it's not relativism. It's much more powerful than that. It's a proposal that says that relativism is a proposal that says that culturally distinct groups interpret the same events differently because of their different cultural backgrounds. He said, no, perspectivism is far more fundamental. It presupposes that all beings see the world in the same way, that what changes is the world they see, because in fact, they see different things from their distinct vantage points. For instance, he says animals see themselves as humans living in their own homes with kinship relations, eating human food, immersed in human relations, but they see humans as animals, either predators or prey. Kinds of reversals that take place in these stories that these ladies tell. One of his key examples comes from the Yukon, and I'm just going to cite it because it's one I heard 30 years ago from somebody who was, when I was first there, I was not there as a student, but a man named Roger McDonnell was there, and he was living in Ross River, and he told me a story that I remember to this day, but it appears in this article too. Roger said, one man, a Casca man from one of the communities at Ross River, invited me to consider a beaver we were watching. What we were able to see was an animal swimming around, cleaning its fur, eating bark and twigs, etc. And he pointed out that we would appear just as different and strange to the beaver as it did to us. He goes on to say, my companion urged me to imagine myself over with the beaver, to reduce the strangeness of all the material and sensible differences that separated us. His inference, he said, was that it was my vantage point that was the problem, that creating the differences. If I were able to shift this, then what seemed to be strange and remote would become intimate and familiar. The inedible wood would become food to eat, and so on. Casca people, he said, believe it's not only possible, but absolutely necessary to be able to make this move. Vivero de Castro goes on to view this as a fundamental challenge to ideas that have become taken for granted in our modern world. At one time, he says, everybody, if you go back far enough in history, everybody was able to make the shift suggested by this Casca elder. But ideas introduced by Descartes into European philosophy began to simplify our chaotic world, making it easier for us to live in by creating these nice binaries. Nature, culture, mind, body, arts, science. We live with this in the university. As part of colonial outreach, he said, these categories get transported across the globe where they begin to have enormous power to shape the way many people now think. And in his view, this has impoverished modern thought considerably and left a legacy in which nature came to be seen as a distinct category, separate from us, but also as providing the universal background, the sort of foundation for all life. And science, he said, has given us the role of discovering the laws by which this nature performs, which he's questioning. So he says Amerindian ontology shuffle this deck. Instead of viewing nature as a kind of universal background, they make relationships the central platform. He says the term nature culture is one thing, you can't slice it apart. Animal human is one thing, you can't make the division that easily. The closest translation in English, he said, he normally writes in Spanish, but he says English is particularly problematic, but a term like culture might be similar to the term spirit. As the foundational principle that binds everybody together, all beings together. That is a capacity to connect with other beings, sometimes on their own terms. We should have that capability, he says. But if beings in the world are connected by this overarching spirit or culture, he says they're divided by nature. They're very different bodily forms and behaviors. What they eat, how they move, how they communicate, what they see, what they fail to see. And vigilant humans, he said, can identify these distinctions. I'm just reminded of what the women I worked with always saying, stop, look, pay attention, look what's going on. You know? So he gets to this question, and again, sorry for summarizing this, but anybody who's interested, I'll give you the references. He said, is there something to be learned here that our Western modern beliefs obfuscate and make it very difficult for us to understand? And I would say, yeah, there is. But I think this is an interesting attempt. He says, the overused term multiculturalism far too easily turns other people's ontologies into beliefs, which we now think is, anyway. So this is the foundation that gives us tech, the idea that other cultural groups might have other perspectives that we can learn from. But he said it turns things into beliefs or even culture. He argues that First Nations in the Americas have a long, rich history of what he calls multinaturalism, whereby different kinds of nature, humans, animals, rivers, trees, glaciers, more, are all immersed in relationships of exchange. They all bring unique kinds of perspectives in this ontology. So his challenge, and this is the final point I'll make, his challenge is if we're really interested in Indigenous knowledge, why not think about multinaturalism as a concept with enormous generative value, just to see where this takes us. It's a very interesting exercise, if you want to try this. His goal, he says, is to decolonize the social sciences. He's talking about anthropology, he's talking about all social sciences, from what he calls this imperialist universality that says nature and culture are always binary categories. Well, just to summarize, I have to say that reading Vivera de Castro, I sometimes find it hard to see where people fit into his stories. But I think he makes sense of a lot of things that people I know say. I want to illustrate with just finish with a couple of stories. One by Mrs. Kitty Smith, who I just introduced there. Mrs. Smith is a contemporary of Mrs. Ned. This story seems hopelessly confusing until it becomes apparent that the characters are struggling with this exact problem of who sees what and who fails to see what. The cast of characters are three. Wolf, so you can identify Wolf here. Woodpecker. This is a Yukon woodpecker. This might not look like woodpeckers you know, but this is Woodpecker. Woodpecker's daughter is also a character, but she doesn't appear very often, so I just put up two pictures. Now, this seems, the thing you have to understand with this story is that in the Yukon, as in many areas, descent is traced matrilineally, and marriage is, the term matrilocal is the term that's used. A man, when he marries, moves to his wife's country, to his wife's family, and he's moving into a place quite often that's very different. He's the stranger. He's the stranger. So the story here is, it's very short, but I'll just tell you and see what you think of this. I heard this story first in 1978, and I've been thinking about it ever since and trying to make sense of it. And this is just one of many attempts. Wolf is the new husband. He marries Woodpecker's daughter, and so he's very much interested in being a good son-in-law. And a good son-in-law is somebody who works for his parents. I still remember one of the very first things somebody told me when I went to the Yukon. I met a woman who introduced me to her daughter, and then she introduced me, and she said, "That's Joe, he works for me now." And I thought, wow, this is a nice idea. And that was her son-in-law. Anyway, so Wolf is trying to be a good son-in-law. His father says, "Go get a moose." Wolf is eager to do this. He heads out, but he's immediately confused because Woodpecker points to an owl and said, "It's a moose, bring it back." And Wolf doesn't know what to do. He knows that he has to how to behave properly, so he brings it back. But he's really astonished, and he's really shocked when his wife even participates in it. They bring it back, they roast the owl, all the time calling it a moose, and then they sit down to eat it, and they give the very best part, the most delicate part, the moose nose, which is given only to special guests or elders. They give it to Wolf as a special treat. But it looks suspiciously like a beak to him, so he hides it. Next day, he's prepared to, he says, "All right, I'm going to get a wolf again." So he heads out again the next day. He comes back, and his snowshoes are completely soaked. So he comes back because he needs his wife to help him dry them out. Woodpecker looks at it, and he said, "That's not a glacier you stepped in, that's a bear den." We're all going again. And Wolf is, again, deeply confused. And woodpecker gets the whole family together, and they all go out. They go to a glacier. It still looks like a glacier to Wolf, but woodpecker cracks it and draws out a giant snake, also all the time calling it a bear. He takes it back, cooks it again. And this time he issues a very clear directive. He said every piece of cooked fat must be eaten. Wolf still knows that food taboo is a reliable way of saying this is something different here, I don't really understand. So he tucks it away again, and overnight there's a glacier surge. And that's the end of the story. You can see why I'm puzzled. And when I asked Mrs., we talked about this often, and she really couldn't understand why I couldn't understand, because it was something. But you know, when I look back, when I was preparing this, I went back to my field notes from February the 28th, 1978. It was the same time that she was telling me different glacier stories. And I think what she was saying, because I was having real trouble understanding what she was saying, is categories, you know, stop using your own categories. You've got to understand that there might be other ways to think about this. I don't know for sure. Mrs. Ned passed on many years ago, but I wish so much I could talk with her. But I think it's a story about categories, and the wolf is the outsider, just as many of us are. It's abrupt ending, but it reveals the close attention paid to differentiated nature in all its complexity. And I think in our time it illustrates the kind of problems that arise when visiting strangers ask questions about nature and interpret puzzling responses as beliefs or myths or anecdotes that can be sort of set aside when you're looking for real knowledge. I want to do one more story that's rather similar. Whenever I've talked about the importance of oral tradition to audiences, there's always somebody who stands up, and I always think this is correct. Somebody will say, you know, this is all fine, Julie, but you had talked with elders who were living earlier. They're older, they're gone now. Younger people really aren't as interested in this. And I just don't really think that's true. But I discussed, when I was preparing this presentation, I talked with Darryl Hain, a colleague of mine at Simon Fraser University, and she had a very interesting story. She described an event she organized called In Search of Hamatsa in 2006 in Vancouver. Simon Fraser has a downtown campus that has a wonderful screen, moving images theater. And so Aaron Glass, who used to be a student at UBC, an undergraduate, he went on and did a PhD at New York University. He had written his dissertation on the whole question of Kwakwaka'wakw understandings of the Hamatsa dance, which it's a very complicated story. It's sometimes conflated with ritual cannibalism. Anthropologists from the time of Franz Boas have written about this, and it's very controversial in the community, and it's very controversial in anthropology. Anyway, she said that that night, the entire audience, and Dara was cross about this, the entire audience was First Nations people. She said nobody else came. First Nations people who were living in the downtown east side. There was a good-sized audience. They came. Aaron presented the film, and then he opened discussion. And she said a woman from the North Coast, who was not an elder, a younger person, stood up, raised her hand, and asked a question. And she said, as Aaron began the discussion, she said, you know, maybe those white guys, she's talking about anthropologists, she said, maybe those white guys didn't understand. Like for us, you might be a human today, but you could have been a fish or something before, and then you might be something else next, and you're sort of something always, parts of many things. Maybe when they thought our old people were cannibals, maybe for them it wasn't like they were eating humans. Maybe they were eating fish or bears. Did you ever think of that? She said to Aaron. Dara said. He was completely stunned. No, he said, I haven't. She said, well, think about it. And she sat down. And I think that's, you know, so a good story. So, and I've also, by the way, I talked with Aaron about this recently by email. And he said, I must say it was interesting, he said he remembers the question, but he was so concerned that somebody was going to be criticizing him for talking about cannibalism that that's what he remembered about it. So he said he would use the story about himself the next time he gave a talk. but I think it is, again, this business of categories. I just want to say that to conclude, in South America, these arguments about multinaturalism are really advancing rapidly. Nature, Pachamama, is shifting from being a resource to being a highly contested topic politically at the same time that ecological crises are really arising and reopening debates. In Peru, in Ecuador, and Bolivia, indigenous popular movements are thrusting these non-human actors, sentient beings that include mountains, water, and soil, into public political arenas. Remarkably, Ecuador, the Constitution of 2008 gives specific rights to Pachamama, or nature. And in Bolivia, in 2011, Bolivia announced its intention to pass the world's first laws granting nature equal rights with humans. So as we enter these times of social and economic uncertainty, it seems likely that humans and animals and land and water and energy are going to be forced into new and unexpected relationships that none of us can even actually predict at this point. The search for a common world is immensely more complicated now that so many radically different ways of inhabiting the earth are being attempted. I tried to find a poster for this. This is my last, oh yes, I'm sorry. This is from Bolivia. In Paris in 2009, Bruno Latour, a name some of you will know, enthusiastically reported on a public debate called The Anthropology of Nature between Vivero de Castro, who we met earlier, and Philippe Descola, who has the august title of the professor of the anthropology of nature in Paris, something. But anyway, Latour approvingly described the debate about nature, and he approvingly described Vivero de Castro's concept, Amerindian perspectivism, which he called a time bomb for anthropology, because he said it demonstrates so clearly that naturalism, our understanding of nature, is just one of many ways humans understand relations among entities. Comparison of naturalism with perspectivism suggests just how unstable and problematic these polarities, like nature and culture, can be made to appear, especially as we enter an era of climate instability when persons and things and ideas are going to be forced into new recombinations. Questions about Indigenous knowledge alive in the world can make us think more critically, I think, about our own modern, taken for granted assumptions. I don't even think environmentalism helps us as much here because we've got a new language to talk about environment. It's pristine, or it's biodiverse, or it's endangered, but it's a redeemable object that we can save. It's always something out there. And so I guess I would just conclude by saying that I think that one of the things we can do as we try to come to terms with thinking about these things is to do what Mrs. Ned suggested a long time ago. Listen for different stories and then just think about them. So thank you very much.
I wanted to wait till the end. It's like you were hovering over one of our classes today. We were having this exact talk, but we didn't say it in such eloquent way. We were talking about co-management in the Yukon with Paul Nadab's user.
Oh, really?
Talking about how all of the same issues that you've been talking about. And I mentioned some of my own experience watching co-management in the Northwest Territories. And what I observed was this structure where people sit around this, almost like a courtroom setting, and act out roles and titles. And then during coffee break, have these amazing chats. And I'm wondering if that's one of the surprises you're talking about, or like if you could maybe just launch into something from that.
Sure. I mean, for me, I think the surprises were the questions that came out of these stories that I was trying to figure out. I think Nadish's work is just absolutely brilliant in this way, and I think that he really deals very directly with this. As somebody who's been living in the community, he's been doing an ethnography of land claims too, which I hope will be published soon, where he's been actually at the table during the whole discussion, so he'll have similar examples. The surprises for me are things like Mrs. Ned's story and the biologist, sort of looking at how that all works. I guess, I was thinking about this more again today. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but I think that we may be heading down the wrong path, saying that this is something that scientists should be taking on. I was really enthusiastic about that at first because I thought, now scientists are going to have to see how it's not so straightforward to just come up with these solutions. But I think that's putting a lot of onus on science, and I really think I think Latour's right. I think it's the social sciences who have to start thinking about this more, because we're bound up in this as well, and humanities. I think of them all as one. I don't think of myself as a social scientist, but the term gets used. So I can probably think of some more examples that I'll really. Well, it's just over and over again. I think of scientists asking a question and then having a story and then not being able to work with it. And I don't think they can be blamed for that, really. I think that but I think we can. Yes.
I'm wondering if you had a chance to see the film that was made by Zacharias Kunik.
Yes.
I mean, elders and climate change.
Oh, actually, no, not that one. I'm sorry, I didn't see that one. I'm sorry, I was thinking of Fast Runner.
Okay, well, it was a collaboration with the University of Victoria biologist, whose name suddenly escapes me. And they interviewed elders specifically on climate change, and the different perspectives expressed by the elders came into conflict with some of the sort of scientific.
So there was a kind of a conflict.
Yeah, and it was just very interesting, but you haven't seen it, so
no, but I will. I'm sorry, I should know that film. The one thing I will say is the one place that I've seen really interesting work going on with scientists and elders is in Alaska, where you have University of Alaska Fairbanks, and you have scientists who've been living there for 25 or 30 years in some cases, who are also dog mushers, who are also out in the land, who are, when they're talking with people from the community, so they're really talking about, they are able to really talk sometimes about the same things. I mean, I think that in some cases they're quite successful. I'm not sure where those go, but I think there's some very interesting conversations where there isn't a sense of, oh well, I have to get back to town because I don't understand what you're talking about. But yeah. I think the surprises are going to come with climate change. Really, I think those are going to be some of the real ones that we're going to have to do.
I work with my Dene language in English, and I do a lot of translation work with my elders and the community traditional knowledge researchers. And so I was interested in what your thoughts were on the changes the elders are noting on the land, the landscape, and if you had come across elders and the way that they talked about the prophecies and the things that they're observing that they feel is coming to pass. Yeah. So I wanted to know if you would make a comment.
Sure, I can do. Those are two separate questions, and I'll try to do that. The interesting thing in the Yukon that I've heard in the communities is people saying, you know, every time a researcher comes to town, they want to do climate change research. We ask for money for housing, we ask for education, we ask for these, and we get one more climate change researcher. So there's been some resistance, I would say, there. But there are, people do talk about prophecies, and they, and that's one of the things that came up during the Berger inquiry, and a lot of those are in the transcripts, people talking about prophecies about the changes that were going to be coming to the land. It's very much woven into those transcripts. Elders that I worked with talked about climate change with reference to the Little Ice Age, because in fact they've lived through climate change. There really was a period where the glaciers were getting around, the dates are usually given as 1550 to 1850, but in the Yukon and in the coast, it's actually up to about 1900 before the glaciers started to recede. So within the lifetime of people I worked with, they'd seen glaciers actually receding, and that was something that they were interested in. It was a period, it was sort of early global warming coming back from the Little Ice Age. So they had a lot to say about that. But I think in the Yukon it may be that there's so many concerns now having the land claims. One of the concerns, I'm just thinking this through. One of the concerns people do talk about is that they negotiated a land claim with clear ideas about land, water resources, wood, a whole range of things, resources that they thought that they would be able to count on. And all those things are now shifting. And so that puts the agreements that are in place under the land claims agreement into real difficulty. But that's some of the younger people who are much more involved in the politics who are talking about those things. I think it's I wanted to say that I think it's really interesting that you're able to work in your Dene language. One of the problems that the women I worked with talked about all the time was the fact that there were fewer people speaking languages. There are 8 different languages spoken within the Yukon Territory, so there were only a few speakers of each, and they really were insisting on writing things down in English because they said otherwise nobody would be able to read them. But so I just think that the kind of work you're doing may encourage more discussion about that kind of thing than you might get in the Yukon. The other thing that I've often been asked about the climate change questions in the Yukon too that's related is I worked entirely with women, and you're probably working with men as well, aren't you? It's in many ways, I think this business of primary and secondary knowledge is really interesting. It really wasn't appropriate for me as a young non-Aboriginal woman to be working with men. That was made very clear to me. And so I work mostly with women. But it was the men who were actually out in the land who probably had those kinds of observations more than the ladies I actually was working with, or even the women I'm working with more recently. So,
I wanted to come back to something that you touched on very briefly earlier on. I've been working in the unit for the last 3 years, and one of the conundrums that's come up is that it's the concept that you were talking about, where people are always, of course, accumulating new knowledge as they go through their lives. So, what was knowledge that came predominantly from the land is now also coming from scientists and television, and there's all sorts of sources. And so, within my committee, my government supervisor is concerned, like, there's almost this desire to have new knowledge that's kind of separate from all of that, but of course it's not separate from all of that. And so, what do you think is what is the solution to that? Like, how do you answer to that?
Yeah, I'll tell you about one example. I think this gets back to the question that was asked earlier about climate change too. I think that knowledge is always being constructed and made in collaboration with other people. In the Yukon, you probably heard there was a situation where a young man who had died, I'm sure how many years ago, was found in the glacier. He was. Originally they thought he was 500 years ago, then they thought it was 150, and now they're saying it's somewhere between 1763 and 1850 that he died. What happened was a collaboration was set up with the University of Victoria, the British Columbia Museum, the First Nation, the archaeology branch in the Yukon, to try and deal with all of these issues. And I would say this is one of the classic areas where knowledge came together. I mean, really, everybody was learning from everybody else in a way. They're now putting out a volume of papers on this, and the most interesting thing to me is the way they're able to sort out some of these. There are papers by people from the community, papers by the biologists, papers by the archaeologists, and they're able to sort of sort out their own, what they each were able to contribute. But you still get a sense that knowledge has been made in this collaboration. Especially from the younger people in the community. I don't know that that really answers the question, but I just don't think, like, knowledge is never static. And there's this whole thing about Mrs. Ned. If the biologist had stuck around, she would have learned some things from him that she would have been really interested in, and they would have come up with something. I think that they were able to, but it takes a long period of time. I mean, this project that I'm talking about has gone on over 12 years continuously since he was found.
So I guess the question is, do you think it's important to be able to disentangle it? Or is it not relevant?
I don't really know. I mean, I don't think, who's the audience? Would be my question.
There's multiple audiences.
Yes.
So there's the audience of government scientists. The communities would like the government scientists to hear their voice. But then there's also, it will go back to the community also.
Right. I think that would, for me, if I were thinking about that question, it would depend on what people in the community thought, because I think they're the most important players in this. So it would depend what they thought. They might want to have their voices separate. Then there might be some way to do that. I mean, by having oral traditions recorded. I really think it depends very much. In this particular situation, they wanted something to come together that would work, that would represent the whole range of ideas. I think that they actually have sorted some of that out by the fact that there are young people from the community who are writing those papers, not just the scientists. So they're able to put in their sections what they want. Maybe it's something that has to be done. I mean, I think it really has to be done in terms of the community's terms in some cases. Does that make any sense? Or?
Yeah.
I just have a comment and a possibly quite mundane question. I mean, I think going back to that scientist that left who wanted to know about the caribou, I mean, all the way through your talk, I kept thinking, if he'd only stuck around, if he'd only stayed around. But I think getting those voices to speak also speaks to something that Caitlin's talking about the other dimension of the political dimension of needing to get information compartmentalized to capture in documents and land claims and agreements with oil companies and mineral companies. And so I think there's the step you're talking about is that first step of trying to getting us to think this, but the layering then of trying to get this way of thinking filtered up or filtered down or across is a complicated piece.
It is, and I think, just talking with some biologists this summer too, I think some of the complications are that biologists really can't just go and spend a week. They have, these are bureaucratic jobs they've got, and so they have to go back to, I was talking to a biologist who was complaining bitterly that he wasn't able to spend as much time as he wanted to talking with people. Now whatever that would actually turn into is hard to say, but I think I think that there's this bureaucratic process that runs against some of the kinds of ideas that people want to have expressed locally. Really ties into your question.
Questions? Other questions? Yes.
I'm going rather far off in a tangent.
That's fine.
But thinking about the stories you were telling us about human-animal relations but I also thinking of your Siberian experience and remembering that beautiful and ultimately tragic story of the chap who found that he could live with the Siberian brown bears. I wonder what your Yukon Aboriginal people would have to say about that.
I think they would say that's probably hubris, in a way. I mean, is this the person who died eventually?
No,
all right, sorry,
it wasn't he that died. It was the bears that died, because they became accustomed to people, and then didn't run away when people with guns arrived. Yeah,
they would. I think the people I knew would definitely say that was hubris. I mean, I think that there's an idea that you can learn. You have to learn from, but there some. I'm sure that they would say that was going too far.
Yes.
Or I'm not sure what they would say. I shouldn't say that because they might have a very interesting take on that I wouldn't be able to. Okay, but yeah, I do remember hearing about that now. I think that it's thinking about the relationships. It's a big part of the stories rather than actually plotting about how to go out and have those experiences of living with animals. It's thinking about how you think about those things that they're really talking about. Good example.
I was thinking of the native people's respect for the animals and their I would think that they would.
Well, here's an example, and it comes back to the first question of Paul Modesty has written an article. This is somebody who was an anthropologist who was living in a small community, and somebody went out of town and said, just look after my traps when I'm away. I've got my traps set out, I'm trapping animals, and you just look after them, Paul. You know this story as well? Yes, and so he was hoping against hope that nothing would get trapped. This is a boy from the city. He's very, very, he spent a lot of time in the community, but he was very uncomfortable about this. So he went every day and was really happy there wasn't. And then finally he got there one day and there was an animal that was trapped and he didn't know what to do with it. So he panicked. He really was frightened. And I can't remember whether it was, did he actually leave or did he tried, whatever happened, it wasn't good. And when he told the person who, his sort of mentor in the community, the man said, Paul, you're just being disrespectful. You know, that animal was giving itself to you. You had an obligation. You should have killed it right away. And so you're just being disrespectful, basically, not to do that. So there's this relationship, an understanding of the relationship of how humans and animals should interact. I'm just not sure that the ladies I know would think that you should go out and live with bears in quite that way. There'd have to be some larger context.
Okay, well, I think we might let Judy sit down, but on behalf of all of us and many other people beyond, I want to thank her very much.
Thank you all
for the stimulating comments and the richness of the ideas with which you've left us this evening that will stay with me, and I hope many others, and maybe even a few politicians along the way, to really come to see the world in a different way. And a small token of appreciation.
Thank you so much.
Just a toaster for the North Series. But I'd like to ask you to all join me in thanking Julie for her talk tonight.
To be integrated into science when they may be trying to do different things, these narratives. In northwestern Canada, let's try this. Okay. I'll come back to this map. I just want to show it to you really briefly now. In northwestern Canada, this is an interesting area for traditional ecological knowledge studies, because late stages of a period that some scientists call the Little Ice Age in this region meant that what you have at the same time, you have changes going on in the environment, geophysical changes, because in fact these glaciers, which are schematically drawn in white here, and I'll come back to talk about some of them specifically, were much larger than they are now. The environment, the landscape looked really different in this area. At the same time, you were getting historical changes because the fur trade was moving into this region. Fur traders were coming up these rivers, the Alsace River. I'm sorry, I did have a pointer, but I think I've left it somewhere. So coming up this river into this country. So you had at the same time geophysical changes and human historical changes. So in a way that for Aboriginal people, I think makes those two really come together very clearly. And I'll come back and talk about this a little bit later. But I want to say something too about the bureaucratic changes that are happening with policy with tech that are going on now. I think that scientists are trying to do one thing, but bureaucratic efforts to incorporate tech, or TEK, as it's sometimes called, into regulatory science and management occurred in this area in tandem with land claims, the settlement of land claims in the Yukon, and also claims to rights to land and to lands more generally. You can see here, this is, to give you a sense of, this is Alaska, Yukon here, and northern British Columbia. And the area that I've worked mainly in is in the Yukon territory east of this region. But even, again, just speaking about the bureaucratic kinds of changes that are happening, even the most isolated communities, any Aboriginal communities anywhere in Canada, we know are now tied to global markets and to international forms of exchange. And I think arguably, in addition to traditional knowledge, Aboriginal people know a great deal now, possibly more than most Canadians, about neoliberal economic and management strategies, because they have such consequences in these communities. So in northern Canada, their current engagement in land claims, which are settled in the Yukon to a large extent, requires now Aboriginal participation in environmental assessments that are occurring with reference to oil, gas, pipelines, minerals, the whole range of things that are opening in the north right now. These community hearings are mandated by national policies that now smoothly incorporate terms like tech or co-management into these bureaucratic frameworks. It's a very different time for those of you who remember the Berger inquiry, when whatever we remember about or think about Berger, he was at least going to communities and talking to people on their own. Terms change, so you hear about beliefs, which is a politer way maybe of saying things, but beliefs or culture. And then onward, it means the term's been used, spirituality, ecological knowledge, and now indigenous knowledge. And I think that there appears to be a really progressive move in language and the way things are being described. But some anthropologists question whether this is just another way of using what they call the tribal slot. There's new language, but certain other things stay the same. So I'm interested in these terms and what they mean and how they're changing. And I think terms are beginning to change again in some ways. Its most recent manifestation is traditional ecological knowledge, usually referred to as TEK or TEK on the west coast and in the north. I don't know how common that term is here, but it's very ever present in the Yukon Territory and in Northwest Territories. Has entered two debates recently in Canada. One is the contributions that local knowledge can make for scientists, field scientists particularly, biologists, geologists, geophysicists, people working in Aboriginal territories, and whether they might be able to learn something from local people that would contribute to their discipline. The other that interests me, and I think it's more recent, particularly in the 21st century, is its use in regulatory science and in hearings that are being held surrounding pipelines and so on in the north. and that takes it in other directions. So I just want to say a couple of words about each of these, and then I'll come back to some more about conversations. Text studies, I think, undoubtedly began as a genuine effort to establish that people who pursue land-based economies know things about what we call nature. Advocates, and I would include myself in that 20 years ago, certainly encouraged field scientists to consider how Indigenous hunters and fishers' ecological knowledge accumulated over generations might contribute something to the kind of work that they were doing. And some scientists now are assigning value, I think would be a good way of putting it, assigning value to land-based hunters' knowledge in projects that try to, and this is their language, to integrate Indigenous knowledge into modernist frameworks. But I don't think this was ever really straightforward, particularly in environmental studies. Scientists who are studying environmental change talk about the need to disentangle cultural, natural and social factors. They talk, for instance, people looking at climate change talk about disentangling what they consider natural cycles and what they consider anthropogenic causes. So trying to separate these kinds of things, whereas Indigenous oral traditions, certainly in the Yukon, try to merge these two things, the social histories with the environmental histories in some ways, and to draw connections among the two. And I think that that's an important distinction, because it sometimes makes it difficult to see how these...
I'm Julia Harrison, the director of the Frost Centre for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies. And tonight's talk is the last in the North at Trent 2012 series. And I'm very pleased to welcome tonight's speaker. Dr. Julie Cruikshank is someone obviously known to all of you in the audience, but is someone who has made a particular impact in the field of anthropology, Indigenous studies, and just a greater realm of understanding of Indigenous people in this country. Has been read by students in anthropology, history, Indigenous studies programs in universities across Canada and the States and globally. She is now Professor Emerita from the University of British Columbia, and from 1997 to 2003 she was a professor in anthropology at the University of British Columbia. She received her PhD in 1987 from the University of British Columbia, having done her MA there previously and her BA in anthropology from the University of Toronto. For more than a decade in the 1970s and 80s, Julie Cruikshank lived in the Yukon Territory, working with senior Athabaskan and Tlingit women who wanted to record their life stories. Working closely with these women and their families, she prepared booklets under their authorship documenting family history, place names, land use, social history, and other subjects, largely absent from history books. Life Lived Like a Story, which is a book that many have used at Trent, and was certainly my first introduction to her work, was written in collaboration with three of her Yukon teachers, Angela Sidney, Annie Ned, and Kitty Smith. And it received the Macdonald Prize in Canadian History in 1991. It's good to know that the historians took notice of what anthropologists were doing. Professor Malloy. Another book about oral history was commissioned for use in Yukon high schools and was prepared with the guidance of the Committee of Yukon Elders. Her books, The Social Life of Stories and Do Glaciers Listen? Local Knowledge, Colonial Encounters, and the Social Imagination, both discuss the work stories do in Indigenous communities where they continue to be told. But she has also extended her research to northern Siberia, where she has worked, where she worked both on oral history projects in 1996 and 2003. Julie Cruikshank has been well recognized and deservedly for her work. In 2010, she became a fellow of the Royal Society. She was also that year the Carnegie Centenary Professor at the University of Aberdeen. Her book, Do Glaciers Listen, which I have to say is one of the most, to me, is the sterling example of interdisciplinary scholarship at its highest level. But that book has won the Clio Award the North from the Canadian Historical Association, the Victor Turner Prize in Ethnographic Writing, which is given by the Society for Humanistic Anthropology, the Julian Stewart Book Award from the Anthropology and Environment section of the American Anthropology Association, and this K.D. Savasta, the prize from awarded by UBC. So I think it's very impressive that one piece has received recognition from so many different dimensions of scholarship and the Academy and beyond. In 2001, from 2003, she was the Brenda David and David McLean Chair in Canadian Studies at UBC. She has won the UBC Prize for Excellence in Teaching. She was the Isaac Walton Killam Memorial Faculty holder of this Killam Faculty Fellowship, and she also won the Killam Research Prize at UBC. It is a very great honor and a sincere pleasure to welcome Julie Cruikshank to Trent this evening and her talk, Listening for Different Stories, Indigenous Knowledge and Its Transformations.
If I could just say a few words about the title and why I chose this. When Julie invited me to come, I decided what I'd like to do is try and present on something that I'm working on rather than something that was completely finished, and I really welcome feedback and criticism on this particular topic. Graham Wynne, who's a geographer at UBC, has organized, he's the McLean Chair in Canadian Studies this year, and he has set up a project called The Nature of Canada and invited some historians and some geographers to write short essays on particular topics. And he asked me if I would write one on Indigenous ecological knowledge. I wasn't sure that that was a good idea for a bunch of reasons, but I thought that I'd do it because I think it's interesting for me to be able to talk about some of the conversations over the years that I've had with people in the Yukon about Indigenous knowledge and some of the ways those conversations are changing. So in that spirit, I'll proceed with this story, listening for different stories. The terms Indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge came into widespread use in Canada, especially in Northern Canada, in the early 1990s. I think you can really track this in the literature, and you begin to see this term turning up all the time. And I think it's very interesting because the term is now used internationally. UNESCO has panels on Indigenous knowledge. And so it's a kind of, these terms begin to change and to accumulate new meanings as they travel. Meanings that have real consequences in Aboriginal communities throughout the world, but certainly in the Yukon. And there's some discussion about that now. Historically, we know that there have been many terms used for Indigenous knowledge, many of which reveal more about colonial ambition than they do about Indigenous worlds. But 150 years ago, for instance, you might have heard the term savagery or superstition, and then terms. These community hearings are now very different. They're regulated much more strictly. So not only do First Nations bear the brunt of decisions about pipelines or mineral developments, they have to resort to uncharacteristic ways of speaking in these hearings in order to accommodate the consultative framework that's set up and designed by the modern bureaucratic state. This integrationist model, because integration is always the term that's being used, integration of traditional knowledge into these modernist frameworks. This integrationist model of knowledge claims to respect cultural difference, but apparently requires no corresponding shift in epistemological or moral stances by the certified experts who are supporting the other sides of these arguments. So it's a complicated situation that becomes more complicated even with land claims, I think. But there are other ways to think about knowledge, and I want to talk a bit about that now. In framing this essay, am I speaking loudly enough? Can you hear me all right? If I speak too quickly, too, just let me know. In framing this essay, I want to draw on conversations about local knowledge practices in Northern Canada, discussions in which I participated over about 4 decades in different ways. I'm using the term here, traditional knowledge, to refer to what we might call tacit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that's embodied in everyday experience, reproduced in behavior and everyday speech, the kind of knowledge you need just to live in the world. So rather than asking how information from hunters might contribute to scientific models, I would like to argue that, especially in this region, the possibility of surprises. We should be thinking about not things that will fit, that will integrate neatly into scientific models or any other models, but we can really, if we look for the possibility of surprises, we might learn a great deal from puzzling accounts that don't seem to fit into official regimes of knowledge. So I'll start with a story from Canada that, from this region, from the far northwest, that I think captures both the fissures and the possibilities of some of these discussions about local knowledge. In 1982, I'm really sorry, I somehow forgot my pointer somewhere in the room. Actually, you know, if you'll excuse me for a second, I think I know where it is. This will help me point and jump about. In 1982, there was a small conference held in Haines Junction, which would be, this smart map doesn't have the Alaska Highway on it, but the Alaska Highway runs along here, and I'll come back to say more about that later. Haines Junction would be about here, Whitehorse is somewhere over here. It was the conference was held in Haines Junction with the idea of bringing together historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, First Nations, and interested public to talk about human history in the southwest Yukon, in this area. This was a really